I think Pokemon Legends ZA might have actually struggled a bit during this holiday season. Over the past year, and perhaps even beyond that, there has been a lot of discussion online about how much Call of Duty is struggling. There's a lot of noise around the franchise for a multitude of reasons, not least of which being just how popular it is. And specifically in 2025, because of the launch of Battlefield 6 and how massive that launch was, the discussion around Call of Duty sales numbers indicating that Call of Duty as a franchise was failing and dying was fairly prevalent in the gaming world. The thing is, while Call of Duty is a franchise that's always been easy to hate, the fact that it was recently purchased by Microsoft just makes it that much easier. See, Xbox is completely fair game. That's a company that you can meme and hate on and make fun of as much as you want. And with good reason. I'm not going to deny you that right. And I'm not even going to say they don't deserve the hate that they get. But when you combine a franchise as popular as Call of Duty, and a franchise that in general seems to be pretty disliked by the general enthusiast gaming community, specifically the ones that are online, and then you combine that juggernaut with the purchase of Xbox, and due to the whole console war thing that we've gone through over the past couple of decades, it means Call of Duty gets scrutinized and put under the lens and judged based off of its past successes rather than how well it's actually doing as a franchise. Now, with all of this doom and gloom around Call of Duty and all of this discussion about how it's dying as a franchise and how they need to pivot in order to win back all of their audience that they've apparently lost, if you look at the data that's been given to us by Circana, you find out that during the holiday season in the United States, which is the biggest gaming market in the world, Call of Duty was the best-selling game. The most recent Call of Duty was the best-selling game in December. And if you look at the chart to see the rankings through the entire year, this failing franchise outsold Madden, and it launched in the last quarter of the year. And not to mention, this game loses some sales because it's available day one on Game Pass, so naturally, the numbers are going to be slightly lower. Now, I'm not going to say that it's wrong to criticize Call of Duty. I'm not even going to say that these conclusions that are being made about the franchise slowing down in their sales numbers is out of line. As a matter of fact, I agree with this sentiment. Even if the game was the best-selling game in December, even if it was the fourth best-selling game in the United States, I think there's a very clear indication that Call of Duty as a franchise is struggling a bit. I don't know if it's necessarily dying, but if that's what the gaming community wants to call it, and if that's what their threshold is for what a dying game looks like, by all means, call it that. I'm not against that. But what I would like to see is that same type of energy put towards the Pokemon franchise. Pokemon is massive, right? It's one of the largest multimedia franchises in the world, if not the most lucrative of them all. Obviously, a lot of this comes from all of their different avenues of wealth that they bring in. Not all of it is through the games, but a very relevant portion of it is through the video games. And when their games come out, they're always guaranteed to succeed. But there is a blind spot for the Pokemon titles. Part of that is due to the fact that people grew up watching Pokemon. Most gamers at some point or another had an encounter with a Pokemon game. Others may have been card collectors, and others may have just grown up watching the anime. And many of us did all of those things at some point in our life. So there is a bit of a blind spot as to what is considered a success or a failure in the Pokemon fandom. But similar to Call of Duty, Pokemon's popularity is largely carried by the mainstream buyers, by those that probably don't even watch video game reviews online, by people that buy a console specifically to play Pokemon and really nothing else. And as such, it's always very successful. It's a blue ocean title. But quite frankly, I think the effort that's put into Call of Duty and Pokemon is not necessarily that different. The Pokemon titles are notoriously very lazy cash grabs. They are low budget titles that now especially are priced way more than they should be, and the quality does not reflect the prices. And while we may have always been heading towards a backlash against the company, it really started to show during the Switch's generation. I remember early cutscenes for Pokemon Sword and Shield, and people were just creating such a big backlash about the game. And back then, I was just like, it's a Pokemon title, like, what do you expect? It's fun. Just buy the game and enjoy it. And then I remember just a massive backlash towards Brilliant Diamond and Pearl, and how much people didn't like the effort or lack thereof that was put into those titles. But obviously, this all pretty much peaked with the backlash that was made against Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. For a multitude of reasons, there was a backlash, there was a boycott, people swore against the franchise, longtime Pokemon buyers that would always purchase every single thing that came with Pokemon day one decided to turn away from their favorite franchise. And what did it ultimately result in? Pokemon Scarlet and Violet had the best launch of any Pokemon game in history. But regardless, I think Pokemon Legends ZA might have actually had the worst launch for a Pokemon game when you consider the size of the market that it's launching onto, as well as the general sales numbers, and then when you especially consider the context of the game coming out. Pokemon Legends ZA was bundled with the Nintendo Switch 2 console. This is a brand new console. This is the most hyped thing you can ever imagine. This is the new Nintendo, the sequel to the Nintendo Switch, which has recently surpassed the Nintendo DS, standing only behind the PlayStation 2, and that's only because Sony found a bunch of PlayStation 2s in their back pocket the other day. By all accounts, Pokemon Legends ZA should have carried the Nintendo Switch 2 to heights unimaginable. And it did to an extent, specifically in Japan, but it didn't really do that in the rest of the world. Now, part of the reason that happens is because Pokemon Legends ZA also launched on the Nintendo Switch 1. But the Nintendo Switch 1 has a larger user base than any other console has ever had, especially for the launch of a Pokemon title. So what you have now is plenty of Switch 1s out there to inflate the numbers for Pokemon Legends ZA more than any other console. It's an advantage that no other Pokemon game has ever seen. And at the same time, you have it being released as a flagship for the brand new Nintendo Switch 2, specifically launching after a drought of first-party titles for the new console. Aside from that, you either had upgrade packs, or you had re-releases of the Mario Galaxy games. And I will be doing a video about the sales numbers for the Galaxy games. Despite all of these advantages, Pokemon Legends ZA couldn't even live up to the launch of the original Pokemon Legends. That's Legends Arceus. In 2022, in the first 9 weeks, Legends Arceus managed 12.64 million units sold, 3.64 million in Japan, and 9.17 million in the rest of the world. Legends Arceus launched in January, and it launched after Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl had just come out, so many people were already enjoying a Pokemon title by the time that game came out. And not only that, Pokemon Legends ZA, eventually their sales just kind of stopped pretty quickly because by the end of 2022, Scarlet and Violet had come out to their massive launch. Pokemon Legends ZA, by all accounts, overperformed when you consider all of the external factors around it. It managed 12.64 million. And not only did it manage 12.64 million, you know the game did well because Nintendo actually shared on their financials the sell-through number for Pokemon Legends Arceus. Something that they only do when they're proud of the number that comes out. Which is something they didn't do for Pokemon Legends ZA, because they know that people would be able to compare it one-to-one. Now, when Pokemon Legends ZA comes out, there had never been a larger gap between two Pokemon titles in years. From Scarlet and Violet until Legends ZA, you hadn't had a mainline Pokemon release. And Pokemon Legends ZA, despite what people might want to have you believe, is a mainline Pokemon game. Now, it's obviously not going to sell 20 million units the way Scarlet and Violet did in their first quarter, because when there are two versions of the game, you gotta figure at least 1/3 of that audience, plus or minus, are going to be buying both copies of the title. But that's also a very big reason why we compare Pokemon Legends ZA to Legends Arceus, because it's a direct sequel to that title, and Legends Arceus also did not have the advantage of having two copies of a game that multiple people would purchase. Now, like I said, Legends Arceus managed 12.64 million in 9 weeks. Legends ZA did fewer than that, in 11 weeks. 12.3 million. Now, 12.64 to 12.3 million is not that big of a gap, but you have to consider the context. Legends ZA had every chance to completely blow the previous game out of the water with all of these advantages, and it sold fewer units. To put things into perspective, do you see the way that Mario Kart World has like doubled the sales of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe in their launch years? The reason that happens is because it's bundled, and it's given all of those advantages that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe didn't have. Mario Kart World did what it was meant to do when it was bundled in with the new console. Pokemon Legends ZA should have doubled the numbers of Legends Arceus, especially because of how big the numbers were with Scarlet and Violet. It seems like Pokemon was invincible, and they could not drop numbers. But it could not match Legends ZA. But it gets worse than that, because once you actually look into the numbers, you find out where those sales were lost, and it's very interesting. Of the 12.3 million that were sold for Pokemon Legends ZA, 4.2 million of them were in Japan. In comparison to Legends Arceus, only 3.46 million of those were in Japan. I'd say that's a healthy growth. There are about 17% more people that bought Legends ZA than the amount that bought Legends Arceus, in Japan specifically. For Legends Arceus, when it came out on the Switch 1, it managed 9.17 million units in the rest of the world outside of Japan. Pokemon Legends ZA managed 8.1 million units. That is over 1 million fewer sales from Pokemon Legends Arceus to Pokemon Legends ZA outside of Japan. That means the earlier game sold over 13% more than the newer one did. And it did it in January, it did it without the bundle of the Switch 2, and it did it with a smaller Switch 1 user base. Now, does that mean that the game objectively is a failure? No, objectively, you cannot call Pokemon Legends ZA a failure. Does it mean that the Pokemon franchise is dying? Probably not. You would be a fool to say that. When Pokemon Legends ZA launched, it was the largest physical retail launch since Tears of the Kingdom. No game that has that kind of credit behind it should be considered a failure or should be considered dying. But at the same time, I don't see why there can't be a discussion about it. I mean, like I said, when Pokemon Scarlet and Violet released, it broke records. It was like the largest Pokemon launch, I think the largest Switch 1 launch, if I'm not mistaken, through the entirety of the console's lifespan. But it was also a very broken game. Many people couldn't even get through the title. It was so bad that Nintendo tweeted an apology to the masses. Now notice that I say Nintendo tweeted an apology, not Game Freak. And it's because Nintendo sees Pokemon as a first-party title, even if Nintendo fans try to claim that it's not. But imagine a game so massive, is so broken, that the company with more pride than any other gaming company in the world came out and apologized to people because of the low quality of the title. So you had a boycott prior to that game that supposedly failed because of how high the sales numbers were. And then the game came out and the numbers were so high and people saw just how awful the effort was put into the game that it was so broken. And then there was no other Pokemon game released until Legends ZA. And then now, Pokemon Legends ZA failed to meet the expectations when you consider how much fewer units it sold, especially outside of Japan, in comparison to the previous title. When you're following up on Pokemon Scarlet and Violet's success, you need to do better, at least, than what Pokemon Legends Arceus did. And if Pokemon Scarlet and Violet were not broken games, and if there was not a massive backlash due to the lack of effort put in from Nintendo, and it wasn't just about the effort of the games, there was a lot of external stuff going around at the time. But if it wasn't for all of that, Pokemon Legends ZA would absolutely have outdid what Pokemon Legends Arceus did. Comparing it to Pokemon Legends Arceus is such a low bar for a Pokemon title. And Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl did more than Pokemon Legends Arceus did. That's how low the bar is. But even with that very low bar, in less time, outside of a holiday season, Arceus still outperformed Legends ZA. And the funny thing is, this was kind of obvious from early on in the launch. And I talked about this on my channel. I said that the numbers that were shown were largely catering towards Japan, were much more in favor of the Switch 1 version as opposed to the Switch 2 version. I mentioned many people online talked about how poorly the sales were doing in Europe and how it was reflected all throughout Europe. And even I discussed how poorly it was doing in the States because the numbers just didn't add up. It was doing much better in Japan, but still launched lower than what was seen for Legends Arceus, which means that everywhere else the numbers had to have been lower. But for some reason people had in their mind that it did very well in Japan, and it did the same in the States and just lower in Europe. And no, that's just not the case. We're seeing this with the hardware numbers, we're seeing it with the software sales. Everything Switch 2 related has done better in comparison to the Nintendo Switch 1. Because in Japan, they still have the favor of the fandom. Largely because they decided to subsidize the consoles and make us pay for a portion of them. But everywhere else in the world, so far, every headline that pops up usually shows the same thing. It starts off saying that the sales numbers are pretty low in Spain. That ends up getting reflected through the UK and wherever else you get data in Europe. And we might not see it immediately when it comes to the States because we don't get actual sales numbers here. But now that we're getting the financial data and we're getting the Circana numbers and we're seeing the hardware numbers and how much they've slowed down in comparison, especially to the first year of the Switch One's life, and especially now that we've heard senior Nintendo employees making these claims, as well as the president of Nintendo himself having the same types of conclusions that I've been having for the past 6 months, I don't think we can deny it anymore. I'm not going to come out here and make the claim that Pokemon is dying. But what I am going to say is if Call of Duty is dying, so are Pokemon games.